I think, frankly, just listening to this, as an economist, I only occasionally lapse into these difficult theories of justice and the politics of it. And it's in an amateurish way almost. After the Clinton health plan collapsed, I asked my colleague at Princeton, Alan Ryan, now at Dawn, explain to me about democracy. I think I don't understand it anymore. And I got a beautiful lecture from him. This is, of course, the beauty of a university, that you get these free consulting services on the spot. So Norm, just to begin with his discussion of justice, in my course I give, the political economy of health system, we have one session on justice. And it always get a headache afterwards because it's so complicated. You know, you think everyone understands what justice is, and then you read their writings and Sens and Rawls, and even Adam Wagstaff's beautiful summary of the concept of justice as we economists think about it in the Handbook of Health Economics. And it really kind of breaks your skull. But I'm thinking almost I need to have two sessions. I just have one. On this, because it gets banded around. We want to have a fair health system, and it's not clear what people actually mean by that. Is it just equalizing opportunities, or is there something else to it, the issue of dignity? What I found interesting, and I have to change my view on it, is this issue that institutions shape values. I should have thought about it, but I never have, and I learned that here, because it is true, one wouldn't really call sort of Bismarck a left-wing, mellow humanitarian. I don't think that's the image you have of him. He was called the Iron Chancellor, and the French in particular have a certain view of him, as, by the way, did the Bavarians. They still call these people pig Prussians. So the idea that institutions shape values, I think it's important. And we had this lively lunch debate yesterday where I said, I'm an unabashed elitist. And I say, oh, it's just my European heritage. We sort of believe that it's the duty of an educated elite to make policies, and now I would say to shape institutions, to teach people proper values. So I'm even worse than I was at lunch last night in saying, but in a way you're right. So FDR and probably some advisors said we're going to have social security, and they just put that in place. And I don't think they had tons of hearings on it. My hunch is, you would know this, Mark, they just did it. And then now everyone learned the value of that, particularly after the debacle on Wall Street. I mean, there was a time where there was a hope for the conservative side to say privatizing Social Security is a great idea. And Henry Aaron had warned how silly that idea is. And I think now even every cab driver will understand this is not, you don't really want Citigroup to manage your money. Or all of it, some of it maybe, but Madoff, well, he's a special case. It's almost a case of beauty to pull that off. You got to admire that, even because I have no money with him, so it's easy for me to say. So that was, I think, an extremely important lesson, because I remember after the Clinton plan failed, we had a session at Brookings, and Yankelovich was, I mentioned that yesterday, blasting the elite for not communicating with the people. But I thought the real problem is that the elite couldn't agree. Because when we agree, we just do stuff. I mean, we don't usually have surveys. Should we do Iraq? We just went. Now, for better or for worse, but we just went. We make war, big decisions. We just make them. And I think I still remain on this view, and I said it there. I think the title was Gazing at Games and Bread and Circus Games, that from olden times on, most of the people really cannot engage on these complicated issues. We need to basically shape the world for them, institutions for them, and teach them. But the elite has to agree And that is the big fight for health reform, is to get the elite to agree. The rest, I think, will be simple. And we don't really need blended surveys for it. I mean, that's where I stand on this. Now, when it comes to the determinants of health, and particularly Norm's idea of flattening the whole SES curve, we economists see that through the production function for health, where basically the output is health, better health. And then you have all these inputs: healthcare, income, education, particularly education of mothers, which again, you pointed out, is a very interesting case I hadn't known about. And if you put that all together, you actually begin to think the way every country has structured the ministries is so dead wrong. We don't really have a ministry of health in this country at all. We have one of health care, or I would call it one of healthcare incomes. That's Alfred E. Newman's dictum: every dollar health spending is someone's healthcare income. And so much of what Congress does is really just shoring up incomes. So we really don't at all have a Ministry of Health. But imagine if we reorganized government and we had a Ministry of Health that was in charge of this production function, or you just use different language describing the same thing, that could have its budget allocated to education or to health care intervention. I think that would be such a really revolutionary reform that you really wonder whether we shouldn't abolish the Department of Education and put it into HHS and have it just all as one. But the flattening of the curve, I think, is very important, but we don't have any institutional framework to do that. We have these silos, and maybe one ought to think as experts or elite or whatever, to think, how could one persuade people to say, we've gone about this all the wrong way? We're putting these huge amounts of money into healthcare on the flat of the curve, and in fact, we're doing it in low marginal returns activities rather than where the payoff really is. So that is, I thought, a very interesting, it never really, we've talked about it loosely, but maybe that should be more organized, and maybe we should run a conference in Washington and really say what we're doing is just wrong. Imagine if you had a factory and everyone was just in charge of one input, what kind of cars you would get. You get beautiful wheels with an engine that doesn't work. And that's roughly what we're doing in here. I was very interested in Mark's two of the things. The first one is these surveys you did that basically says maybe I'm overly sensitive to the conservative bashing I get, and maybe conservatives disproportionately beat up on me. So I saw that you said it's only 11% who actually believe this stuff. My email sort of shows it's more than that. So I'm very interested in your slides to see this systematically, because there's a certain hope then that if the elite, what I believe we should do, we're actually not really contravening what the public wants. And there I agree with you too. Elites should not cram down on people what they really hate. I mean, there should be some information. What do these people want but cannot articulate? And we need to shape that for them. So I found that an extremely interesting insight. The other thing that is very interesting, when you say how the populace attitude to government changes, that you have these waves, even the timing I wasn't so aware of. But you begin to wonder if that's not also true for individuals, because I'm still bothered that it's not just majorities each having clear views on things, but individuals being very confused. And I see that sometimes in our own children, for reasons I don't understand. One of our children is to the right of Attila the Hun, or was. One to the left of Karl Marx, and I don't know, the Marine sort of, he's a very interesting guy. He did a survey on the computer, and it turns out to be an Edwards guy, he tells me, but in fact he votes quite the other way. So there he's both conservative and very liberal. And I think that comes from being a Marine, which is inherently a socialist institution, where officers eat last. I don't know if you knew that. Officers in the Marine Corps eat last. It's not the Navy where officers eat first. So he has the ethos of a socialist from the Marine Corps, but he was politically conservative going in. So I sometimes wonder whether human beings don't go in cycles. I noticed that even with our oldest, who once he experienced that he had to buy some drug for some cold or infection, probably antibiotic, and the full brunt of it, he was really cursing. And I said, imagine a waitress. He was working on Wall Street. I said, imagine a waitress having to meet. And he said, I agree with you. That should be solved. And all of a sudden, his values changed just by experiences. And maybe you are right. This experience we're now undergoing, we're solidly middle-class people on Wall Street who had little Häusle on the Hamptons, all of a sudden have to give them up. Maybe that'll shake us up and change the values in a way. So you gave me hope, Mark, with your comparing the Clintons. I mean, for one, Ira Magaziner being on the island of Elba, or wherever he is probably not a bad idea when you do health reform, replacing him with Daschle. I hadn't thought of it. I was much more pessimistic about the prospect of health reform. But when I listened to your contrast of 92 and now, maybe we can get this done, or substantially done. So I don't know if I have any more particular point. One thing about when you look at actuarial equations and see the equation for life expectancy, which is sort of a weighted average, a very complicated thing, you realize how insensitive that weighted average is to particular medical interventions. Because here is this contradiction. You can certainly say if you use populations, you can show, as Sherry showed, healthcare really doesn't make a whole lot of difference in this. But boy, when you're sick, you sure believe that it does, and it does, big time. And it was never driven home so much to me as once when I ate something bad in the Rocky Mountains and I had sepsis. And without healthcare, that would have been it. So you begin to say, what do you mean healthcare doesn't matter? It sure does. So there is a sort of a contradiction. I think part of that is just in the actuarial equations. Aggregating up, if you make somebody who's 80 and give them 3 more years of really terrific life, that will hardly ever affect life expectancy. And if you do something very little for a young kid, that'll do a lot. So I think the metric life expectancy is, to me, very suspect. There is such a thing as quality of life, even if you consumed all kinds of health care and it did nothing for your physical health status, just knowing that you don't have an illness, that you don't have tumor in your head, etc. That is valuable output, which these metrics never capture. So part of it is that. On the dignity issue, I believe that is part of the output of a health system. And it always troubles me when, from the conservative side, people say, well, to be uninsured doesn't mean you don't get health care. You get this from the National Center for Policy Analysis, John Goodman, a good friend. But I tell him, it's not just about going there with a tin cup begging for health care. It's really about the health care experience, the whole thing, including whether later on you have to fight over medical bills. And that reminds me of an interview my wife and I did with the Minister of Health of Germany. It was published last year in Health Affairs. And my wife asked Ulla Schmidt, the minister, you made a big deal about you moving to universal coverage in Germany, but you had only 200,000 uninsured in a population of 80 million. Why is that such a big deal to you? We wouldn't even notice that here. And the answer was interesting. She said, well, as a minister, I find it offensive that there should be anyone in Germany begging for health care. And that was the dignity issue. And she said it is undignified. And that drives policy. So I'm glad you mentioned that. That should be a variable. You don't see that usually mentioned. Somebody ought to get it through to Daschle and Obama to make that a big issue. Begging for health care, when you're down, you're sick, you're aching, and on top of that you have to beg, is really an unseemly thing, I think. So you can justify health insurance on that alone, and Minister Schmidt did on this very issue. The other thing that I like very much is the three level. I must say I personally hadn't thought about it that way, but I do recall I was one of the 5 advisors to Senator Bradley when he ran for the primaries. And I had written for him, I said, this is the speech. Don't do as the Clintons, spec everything out. You're going to get beaten to death. Just have a theme, a big theme. And the theme, I still have it on my machine. They say, ask the people, do you want to live in a society where the waitress who serves you cries because his child is sick and she can't get health care? Do you want to live in this? And the whole thing always was, do you want to live in a country where your neighbor has to sell the house because someone had cancer? Or and so on, or somebody dies that could have been saved. And it's a big theme. And then sort of saying, I have a solution, but we can talk about it. We will negotiate the way Obama did do it, right? And so I had not thought about Obama actually. I had a big argument with Stuart Altman and said, why don't you go for the mandate? You know we all favor that. And he said, this is not about that. This is about a theme that we're having. And so, and it is true, the Clinton plan was once again specced out in fair detail. And the mandate issue, if Senator Clinton had run against Senator McCain, the mandate issue would have been another Harry and Louise. And I had never thought about that. That is le vis of the Democrats. The vice of the Democrats is always to think everyone else out there has a PhD in health policy, when in fact most people just want to have an image of a theme. I thought that was very useful. So I take away incredible richness from this. Your idea of justice, and I have to rethink this, reread your stuff. And this book you did, is that the book with, I mentioned with Dawn Light, about a check mark? There was sort of a checklist. When do you know that a health reform proposal meets basic tenets of justice? So there was a real pragmatic piece. But all of that is really worth working on. And we economists just don't ever deal with this, and really should read more in that. So that was, there's so many rich insights I take away from that I would have flown here just to listen to you three. Thank you very much.